to the industry at this time of great uncertainty. To kick off, we'll be reflecting back on the last 12 months and taking stock of our current position. Later, we consider what are the big issues. And in the third session, the panel discuss what do we need to do next. First today, in this Brexit360 special, we want to know where we are. To answer that, I'm joined by a panel of experts. But before meeting them, let's hear from some farmers.
I personally voted not to come out, to stay in, because I don't really agree with the way things are done in Europe. It needs reform, but I thought we were far better off in Europe than out of it. Saying that, we voted to get out. Let's get out. Let's get on and do it. Don't faff about. They say give you another vote to stay in or stay out. No, we voted to come out. Let's get out.
A year ago, when the election came, I voted out. I voted out not for me, but I voted out for the next generation. Some people would say that was a turkey voting for Christmas, and I'm not sure that it probably is a turkey voting for Christmas from my point of view. I don't think it'll be easy over the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, but my grey hair will tell you I'm no spring chicken, and the next generation of 25, 30-year-olds may get a better chance in 20 years. Who knows?
A year ago, the country decided to vote out of Europe, and I actually voted out. My heart told me that we needed change within the country. My head told me that from a business decision we needed to stay in. We have a lot to be proud of in this country. We are some of the best food producers in the world, and I think that is going to be something that we will be armed with to go forward with trade negotiations. And I think we need to be shouting from the hilltops as far as what we do and how good at it we are.
And now for our panel. I'm joined by Phil Bicknell. Phil is the Market Intelligence Director, and he joined AHDB in January 2017 to head up the 60-strong team of market and data specialists, providing high-quality, independent analysis and insight. Phil was the NFU's head of food and farming and formerly their chief economist. Growing up on a family livestock farm, Phil is an agricultural economics graduate from the University of Reading. David Swales, head of strategic insight, joined AHDB in 2010 and is the head of strategic insight responsible for consumer and market intelligence research. The team provides information to farmers and growers, as well as providing evidence to shape the organisation's strategic direction. David has written a number of AHDB's Horizon reports. Sarah Baker, AHDB's senior analyst. Sarah joined AHDB in 2015. Since the Brexit referendum in June 2016, Sarah has been primarily focused on the Horizon series of publications, examining the likely effects of Brexit on the industry. Sarah is an agricultural economist from Y College. I'm John Bates. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining me on the panel today. Phil, just to get us started, tell me, there's a lot of uncertainty, but what have we learnt in the last 12 months?
I think one of the things that we have learned is, as you say, there's an awful lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things that we don't know. One thing that we do know, of course, is that the clock is ticking. Article 50 was triggered back in March. That gives us that 2-year time frame for negotiating our exit from the EU. It also sets the clock ticking in terms of trying to work on some of those big areas that we know are concerned from agriculture. What's our future farming policy going to look like? What's our trading relationship with Europe going to be like? Where are we going to get access to labour, not just from the seasonal workers, which is probably a big focus, I know certainly in the media this week, but more widely in terms of the agri-food supply chain, where we're going to get the workers from. At the moment we rely quite heavily on overseas workers in some parts of our food chain.
Now, some of the big issues that you talk about, David, we've tried to capture some of those, I know, in the Horizon documents that you've been working on. What's been the approach to producing those?
Well, for me, there's a whole host of issues with Brexit, and what we've tried to do is cover the sorts of topics and questions which levy payers have been asking us. For me, one of the absolute critical issues is around trade. We know that EU is by far and away our biggest trading partner, with about 2/3 of food and drink exports going to the EU. Now we know our relationship with the EU is going to change, and that the government is seeking a comprehensive free trade agreement, which hopefully will make trade barrier free with the EU, or certainly tariff free with the EU. I think probably the outcome of those negotiations is absolutely key here. If there is no deal on trade, that will mean we default to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, rules and tariffs. And some of those tariffs are really high, which we've outlined in some of our reports, around 50% for beef and lamb products, and they're also high for dairy products as well. So, Joey, we're really keen to, hopefully, the politicians can avoid that outcome. Yeah, if we don't, if there is no deal, there's a whole host of issues there which we'll need to explore and understand what the impacts are for agriculture.
Sarah, if I can turn to you. So David mentions the World Trade Organization, clearly very significant. What have we learnt about the WTO?
Well, it's been a really interesting opportunity to shine a light on some of the details surrounding the World Trade Organization. For instance, I often hear that one of the reasons that people in farming voted for Brexit was a certain disillusionment with the common agricultural policy, and they felt that Brexit would offer an opportunity. It's very important to rewriting agricultural policy. The WTO exists to facilitate and promote a very clear set of rules and regulations. If you the type of policy that's or deficiency payments, they simply wouldn't be allowed under WTO rules because they'd be deemed as trade distorting. Okay,
so how might tariffs operate? Can we just explore that?
Well, if we strike a deal within the WTO guidelines, if we strike a free trade agreement with another country, then we can trade on whatever we agree within that agreement between the partners. But the WTO has what's called a most favoured nation principle, and that means that for the vast majority of trade that lies outside those free trade agreements, so for all trade outside the free trade agreement, which is probably the majority, they have to have the same level of tariffs to all those countries. If you lower tariffs to one country, you have to lower them to everybody. Now, in practice, the European Free Trade Association and the European Union have what's called a common external tariff. That's quite high for agriculture, as has been alluded to before. If we strike a free trade deal with the EU, then we may be able to lower those tariffs in agriculture. However, if we leave the EU without a deal, then we will revert to WTO tariffs. We then have the choice about where to set those tariffs, so long as they're consistent with everybody. The likelihood is we will adopt the same level of tariffs as the current common external tariffs.
I suppose one of the things for me is trade is a complex, and as kind of you can tell from Sarah talking, it's a very technical area. As I try and take a step back and try and get my head around it, I suppose taking a protection it through the common agricultural policy, relationships and tariff barriers to keep out to Europe, to moving outside of that protection relationship is going to look like. Will we face tariffs? But it's an unknown industry.
And in under 2 years, you know, it's not long, is it, to resolve these matters?
Well, 2 years probably isn't long enough, I think, is the reality, and there's already discussions going on about some sort of interim deal. We want to avoid the cliff edge people talk about.
Transition and phasing is what has been talked about in the news in the last couple of weeks.
Definitely.
And the political rhetoric has probably changed in the wake of the election.
Mm.
So I mean, what's the reality? How do we see things developing?
Good question, and it's one of the we'll get the AHDB crystal ball out. But I think from my perspective, there's a school of thought where you can look and say, well, actually, we were seeing agricultural policy change anyway. We were seeing reducing levels of support coming through CAP. That was the direction of travel and has been for the last 20 years or so. We were seeing at the same time the market become much more important. A bigger proportion of farmers' returns were coming from, not in the form of farm support, but from the marketplace. So the direction of travel for me felt like where we're heading to as an industry was understanding much more about what the market needs, meeting those needs and getting more of our returns and more of our revenue back from the marketplace. I think Brexit accelerates that. I think it starts to create some challenges in terms of where farm policy might be, but I think it just means that farmers are probably going to be closer to the market, more reliant on the market. What does that mean in terms of how we approach? Well, I suppose one of the things that sticks with me is maybe in the past, some parts of our sector have produced something first and then worked out how to sell it and where to sell it. It's probably thinking about actually what is it the market needs and then producing exactly what it is the market needs.
And David, are the Horizon documents intended for farmers and growers to read to help inform their investment decisions and so on?
Well, certainly we've aimed the reports at farmers and growers, so we're trying to produce information which farmers and growers and our other levy payers will find useful and hopefully sort of debug some of the myths, provide some good background information around what's going on, and increasingly we're looking to sort of outline what some of the sort of future impacts might be so people can perhaps understand those and start to plan and take some action now. We have sort of talked about, well, I'll wait and see what happens. It's all very uncertain. I don't know what will happen, so time for these talks to play out. They're hugely complicated issues to talk to. The EU have already said they sort of initial details are worked out through time here. So I think, John, for me, our levy payers should be beginning to work up some scenarios of what they think might happen and begin to put some plans in place.
Sorry to interrupt, John, it happens sooner than you think. When I think about my family farm, the cows that will have calving later this year, those calves will meet supply chain in a post-Brexit here sooner than we think.
I think that brings up a really, now as an economist, you know, we all know that tomorrow and then farmers to decide or had certain issues around uncertainty in a even less really area for which farmers do have control and make those in the best possible shape to get Brexit ready.
So the series of Horizon documents that have already been published, just so that our viewers are aware, they're available on the AHDB website. So our viewers can go to ahdb.org.uk/Brexit and you can download all of those documents there. Are we working on any more documents currently?
Yes, documents coming through, as you've already out next week and will be launched at the Export Conference. We also have a livestock trade opportunity document coming out in the near future, and then we're very much listening to what our levy payer needs to know. So we're thinking carefully about the next stage of the planning is, we've sort of said here is change, this is what it looks like, what do you need to do? So the next crucial stage is the quantitative modelling which we've commissioned, which is actually drilling down to farm level and looking at the impact of the various possible post-Brexit scenarios and seeing how that will impact on farm structure, farm prices, farm output, to really give people an idea of where the possibilities lie and what they need to do in order to get their businesses fit for post-Brexit world.
And I'm really conscious that maybe when we talk about some of the big issues around trade or agricultural policy, it might be a bit distant from when I put my farmer hat on, I find it maybe quite difficult to think about it as a Warwickshire livestock farmer about some of the international trade issues and think through how they impact on me. So I'm really pleased with the work that we've got in the pipeline, which will start to look more specifically at what the impacts could be under different scenarios and different sectors. So we get that work back on the average beef and sheep farmer, what that means for them. That's easier for me.
If you're watching us live, you can direct AHDB. So this is a live debate. We're looking forward to receiving your questions. Just tell me a little bit more about, I would imagine lots of farmers are very concerned about the support that is seems to be in place until 2020, and then there's some uncertainty. What's our view? Where are we likely to end up?
The Conservative manifesto has now extended that to 2022, so we have some level of continuity. What will happen after that at the moment is unclear. As Phil alluded to earlier, the general direction of travel is that the level of support is downwards, and that would have happened under the Common Agricultural Policy anyway. So I think farmers are fairly well briefed and understand that fairly well. Again, it's very dependent on the trade agreement that we strike, because if we are going to trade with the EU, we'd like to trade on a level playing field, and therefore we're more likely to have policies and regulatory frameworks that align more with the EU. However, we can see that we're now subject to annual changes, annual budgets with Treasury and so on, and that might change significantly. So I think in order to be realistic, we need to look at probably significant downward movement in the levels of support.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Conservative manifesto was pledging the overall level of support for farming through to 2022. I suppose some of it is trying to think about how that is delivered through specifically policy measures. How might that start to change and evolve? Sarah's already mentioned about the WTO constraints that rule out things like a wide-scale return to headage payments or deficiency payments. And when I was travelling around the country 12 months ago, those were some of the ideas that farmers was thinking, well, actually that would be great to get that sort of support mechanism back. That just isn't going to happen. And when we start looking around the world, and that's one of the things that we did with the Horizon report last year, was starting to look at what does farm policy and support look like elsewhere in the world. There's some pros and cons with things like insurance schemes that are more common in North America. I suppose when I specifically start to look at things like that, I also start to scratch my head and think, how would we apply those to the UK? Take crop insurance, for instance. We tend to see relatively little variation in terms of our yield from year to year, whereas in some parts of North America, much more pronounced. So you can see the value of an insurance program if they have crop failure or significant wiping out of yields. We're a bit more level in terms of where we are. So trying to think about how we take something from elsewhere in the world and apply it to the UK, that also needs some thinking through as well.
There's a lot of talk about a move towards more environmentally focused support. The sort of pillar 2 under the Common Agricultural Policy, and it's important again to recognise that there are constraints under WTO on that. If it's seen to be indirectly supporting production or subsidising production, then again we could be penalised for that under WTO. So it needs to be very carefully thought out, and there are a huge number of complexities.
I think for me a central issue around all of this is public goods for public money. So when you look at the debate around the Common Agricultural Policy over the last few years, UK governments of various forms have been quite critical of direct payments. They've said, well, John, what value do taxpayers actually get from that investment? So for me, environmental payments, risk management type approaches, these sorts of things are things which the government could argue actually there's some public good for delivering that money. So I would expect there's going to be significant change in the nature of support and how it's delivered.
In the long run, and I'm conscious that we've got Tom Keane from the NFU joining us later on this morning, and they'll obviously have a lot to say around that. I think some of the areas that I'd be keen to see in the long run would be looking at how do we use whatever the policy measures are to try and boost farming, to boost investment, to overcome some of the challenges that you alluded to, Sarah.
Absolutely.
To make sure that we are shaping up and getting fit for the future.
Yes, definitely. In that, if you looked to other countries in the past, for instance, New Zealand and Australia, when subsidies were removed, part of the response to that was included in government policy. So very specific policies to encourage investment and drive productivity. And I think that's a very, very important aspect to help the industry transition to a post-Brexit world. Having said that, I don't think a sudden removal of subsidies is helpful to anybody. And I don't think necessarily that parallels with New Zealand are particularly helpful across the board. But the point I was trying to make is that the government policy in response to that was very tailored towards driving the issues, the underlying issues in the industry, and I think lessons can be learned from that.
Yeah, I think there's lots of parallels made between the challenge that we might face post-Brexit with New Zealand, and we hear it on a fairly regular basis about, well, subsidy and support was removed. I think the situation in New Zealand, where you've got a population that is, 3.5, 4 million people, versus here in the UK, where we're 65 million people, they're a net exporter, we're a net importer of food. Some of the drivers for them and their policy decisions were very much around pressures on public finance. There's some
massive devaluation of their currency.
and that helped them from an exporting nation. So I think as tempting as it is to use New Zealand as a bit of a parallel or benchmark, I don't really think it's appropriate.
Obviously, we're a non-lobbying organisation, but clearly there's been the Queen's speech this week, and there are a couple of bills there that are specifically, or 3 bills that are specifically relevant. Is that actually encouraging? Are we pleased about that?
I think it was essential. I think we have to, with the time frame, with the clock ticking, they had to be in there. I think
there are a lot of bills that weren't.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think looking specifically at the Great Repeal Bill, which I understand is now just the Repeal Bill, that in itself raises a huge number of issues for agriculture. There simply isn't enough government time in order to sort of rewrite all that legislative framework around membership of the EU. So the idea is to cut and paste it into UK law. However, there are a huge number of rules and regulations in there that rely on EU institutions for enforcement and regulation, and therefore they can't simply be cut and pasted. They need amending before they can be cut and pasted, and that in itself is an enormous piece of work. So I think it's beginning to become clearer just the size of the task that lies ahead.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the Agriculture Act, as Sarah says, it was essential. I suppose around about 40% of the European budget was or is on agriculture. CAP is a major part of the EU's work. So the fact that as we exit the EU, it's inevitable that we need to be focusing from an agriculture perspective. So the one issue that perhaps we need to bear in mind as things pan out, as we start to look at agricultural policy in future, is of course agriculture is a devolved issue. So as much as we might be talking about what sort of farming policy we might have in the UK, actually that's an issue for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. So that starts to create some interesting challenges around consistency of an overall framework.
So I should think our viewers would be interested in what we see as next steps. So we're into the countdown. It's a year on since the referendum. What do we see happening from an AHDB perspective, talking to farmers and so on? How do we see the next few months panning out?
Well, I think the piece of work Sarah mentioned is absolutely critical for me, because we don't know exactly what type of outcome we're going to get. But I think we are beginning to get a feel of the likely scenarios. So the work which we're doing is trying to map out what those scenarios look like and what some of those initial impacts will be, both in terms of the marketplace, but also in terms of individual farms. So what would a typical potatoes farm or a typical cereals farm, what's going to happen to their bottom line, what's going to happen to their input costs, what's going to happen to their support payments under these different scenarios. And I think by putting that information out there, what we hope will happen is farmers can begin to look at what these things mean for their businesses and begin to plan what they need to do next.
And it's asking ourselves the challenging what-if questions, I think, and that will be tougher in some sectors than others. But from a horticulture perspective, what are we going to do? Where's the labour going to come from? That's we might not have the answers right now, but those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves and thinking about some of the contingency plans and working through those different scenarios.
Absolutely, it's a very fast-moving piece of work, if you like. It's constantly evolving, and as more information comes out during the negotiation process, obviously we will incorporate that in our work and make sure that that's reflected in outputs that can be valuable to the levy payer.
And just in practical terms then, so when you're writing these documents and we're talking about understanding what impact these things may have on individual farms, is the approach to go out there and talk to farmers and run meetings, or how is this information gleaned and shared?
Well, absolutely. So, John, we're very keen if farmers are able to contact us today and ask questions. If there's things which farmers need to know or want to know and questions they have, we're here to help them. So, do you know what I mean, the work we've done today has very much been driven by what levy payers have asked and the sorts of queries and questions they've posed to us. So we're keen that that continues. We get out and about as much as we possibly can. So myself, Sarah and Phil have all been out presenting up and down the country to various groups and various conferences. And we've had really good feedback on the type of information we've presented to.
And
Well,
so
we have-
farmers,
sorry.
so that they know where these opportunities are, that information can be gathered from the website as well, can it?
Yes, yeah, that's all on the website. And just to add to David's comments, we will be out in the autumn with some joint meetings with the NFU to talk in detail around our quantitative modelling work. So to really take the detail out to farmers in their regional meetings. So we should run a series of meetings over quite a short period of time to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to come and ask us questions and really drill down into that information.
And keen to get out there as much as possible and talk through some of the issues, understand what the challenges are, what the next set of questions that farmers have got. I think what we've done so far gives hopefully some level of understanding, helps people start thinking about the big issues. Keen that myself and the team get out as much as possible.
And it's fair to say, of course, that everybody could be impacted, obviously, from Brexit. So whether you're a large farmer or you're a small farmer, you know, engage with us, share the issues, you know, allow us to understand what the things are that concern you, and then perhaps we might be able to provide some thought for you to consider and apply to your own business.
Absolutely, this is a partnership. We're going to work with farmers and with levy payers in order to move this forward and make Brexit as successful for them as possible.
And I think the great thing from my perspective is in the wider AHDB, we've got the tools, you know, kind of when we're starting thinking about some of the aspects of understanding business performance, then some of the work that we're doing around benchmarking is pretty integral to that. If we're looking at how do you understand more about the market you operate in? Well, that's something we do from a market intelligence perspective in terms of the analysis of what's happening at the retail end, about how different drivers and different factors are changing the market dynamics. And I suppose, you know, it's really easy to think that from a farming perspective, you might kind of, to some extent, you're producing something and the last you see of it is when it goes to the abattoir on the market. There's some pretty major changes that are going on at the consumer end, whether that's driven by convenience, whether it's responsiveness to price, whether it's increasingly health, and understanding those changes and what that means for our product is going to be more and more vital.
I'm conscious of time, and we've only got a few minutes left, so perhaps I'd give each of you the opportunity to you know, to sort of summarise or to make any particular points that you want to make. David, shall I sort of turn to you first as to what next steps are?
Well, certainly in terms of big issues, I think for me, trade is the critical one. We've spoken a lot about trade with the EU today, and that trade deal really is going to be critical. We don't know exactly where we're going to end up, but there's a lot of hope that we'll get a comprehensive free trade deal with the EU. We haven't really talked about trade outside the EU, but the EU obviously helps and sets the rules and governs that, and there's probably quite a lot of opportunities out there where maybe a UK approach may achieve more than the EU has managed to achieve in recent years. So in the sort of medium to long term, there's probably some good opportunities from Brexit as well, which we shouldn't overlook.
Yeah, so that's quite encouraging, isn't it? So rather than just adopt a position which just sort of says, you know, this could all be very, very difficult, we should also be looking at it, well, actually, this could be quite exciting and this could deliver well for UK agriculture.
And that's something we launched a report at the Cereals event recently that looks at grain market opportunities. What that does flag up is there are opportunities when we look around the world, but it means that we might have to do things differently if we're to fully exploit those opportunities. That'll be the same when we're looking at some of our meat and dairy potential export destinations in future, when we certainly look beyond the EU. We might have to do things differently to be able to tap into them and to be able to compete against other suppliers in the global marketplace. The one other thing that we shouldn't forget, I mentioned the 65 million consumers here at home. We've got a domestic population who are relatively affluent, who care about food provenance, about food quality and where it comes from. So we've also need to make sure that we're fully exploiting those dynamics and those trends at home.
I think for me it's the level of uncertainty and the potential, mitigating the potential damaging effect that could have on UK agriculture, and making sure that as soon as information is available, we translate that into what does that mean to your business, and really help our levy payers through this process, because it is going to be challenging, but challenge brings rewards as well as risks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's really very interesting, as you can see from that debate. This 360 debate is going to continue later in the day at 11 o'clock. We've got another live broadcast, and then one again at 1 o'clock. So thank you to the panellists. I'm very grateful for the contribution that they've made this morning. You can see from their enthusiasm and understanding, farming matters. I've got a few thank yous. I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank the crew for doing what they've done. My producer, Joe Crowley. Thank you to the panellists. And I'd like to remind you that if you need Brexit information, you can access that via the AHDB website. So visit ahdb.org.uk/Brexit. Thank you for watching.